Welcome to today's episode, and today's episode is dedicated to installing local instance of Creatio on your machine, installing it on site. And so today we're going to take a look at some of the steps that are required, that are expected of you as a developer or as a system administrator to perform in order to deploy Creatio on your local machine, be it a server, be it a local workstation, for development purposes, for testing, for pre-production, it doesn't matter. We're just going to take a look at some of the required steps. What you're seeing on the screen now is I have navigated to Creatio, or I have navigated to academycreatio.com, and I went into a documentation section. So if you just simply click on this documentation button, you will be greeted with a lot of documentation. Towards the bottom of the page, you will be able to find documentation on setup and administration right here. And if you come here on the left-hand side, you will find a way to deploy. Here is a link that we will follow. And in this case, we're going to be following on-site deployment instructions. Now, there are a couple of instructions, or the documentation is broken down into multiple sections just to make it a little bit easier. So we're going to cover one by one. Let's start off with system requirements. System requirements broken down into client and server side, and client we'll skip for now, but essentially you need to make sure that you have a modern browser. Now in here in system requirements, this is where the more difficult part starts. The article goes into details explaining various possible installation options, and it's listing some deployment ideas here where you have .NET application or IIS server. You've got a database, could be MS SQL, it could be a Postgre, it could be Oracle, and a third component, a minimum component, Redis. And this constitutes a minimum required components that are necessary to run Creatio. So Redis, IIS, and a database of your choice. There are more difficult and more challenging installations. For example, when you want to go in the farm, when you want to go load balancer, when you want to run Redis in the cluster, you can configure your installation in that way. But for our purposes for today, for simple development machine pre-production, we're not going to be going with the installation of farm, as it's fairly technical and it's fairly specific to your particular application. So let's scroll down and see what we need to do. There's a lot of text here, but I'm just going to take you to the most interesting parts. The first part is we need to make sure that our servers, or the underlying OS that we want to install, is supported. Now here we see that the server, Windows Server 2012 and up, are supported. However, Windows 10 is also supported. Now in our example today, I will be using Windows 10 machine for the deployment, but you could use Windows 10. I believe even earlier versions will also work if you run them. Now we can install it on Linux in Debian, but we're not going to be using it for now. Most of the people will be installing it on Linux, on Windows, not on Linux. And so we're going to address this part first. In order for us to deploy Creatio, we need to first make sure that our Windows machine complies with all the requirements. So let's go into deploying Creatio.NET Framework application on Windows. Let's follow this link. When we follow this link, we'll see that some requirements or some packages we need to install. We need to make sure that we install .NET Core SDK 3.1 and that we install Framework SDK 4.7.2. This will be required for our application server to compile your source code, or to compile the application, do many tasks that when we run wizards, etc. Now, there's also a bunch of requirements here on the Windows component side, and this is what we're going to concentrate on. Now, if you need to download your SDKs, just make sure you follow the link and click through the installation guide provided by Microsoft, and these SDKs will be installed. Most likely, your machine will need to be restarted or rebooted at least once when you're installing it, so please take some time. There's also another .NET Core SDK that is required if you want to run Identity Service. You need .NET Core 2.2. So you're also going to have to go and install it, and I'll show you how to do that later in this tutorial. In here, we see that the Windows 10 is not a production grade OS, and yet it's still supported. So let's take a look at these common features, and let's take a look at the components that Windows machine needs to have installed prior to trying to or attempting to install Creatio. So on the left-hand side, the features are broken down into their related components into groups, and on the right-hand side is the name of the component itself. Now, in order for you to install these components, you need to navigate to Control Panel and activate them. This is what I'm going to do. So on my Windows machine, I'll just press Start button and say Control Panel and go to my Control Panel. In here, we can go inside the programs, and in the middle, there's going to be Turn Windows Features on and off. This is the screen that we want to get to. Now, depending on what you already have installed or what rights you have on your machine, you may have some of these components installed. Make sure that your SDKs, .NET Core and .NET Frameworks are previously installed, otherwise you will not be able to see these two checkboxes. Now, it's time for me to install these components. The installation is fairly straightforward, as all you need to do is just simply find the component, which is the most challenging part, and then put a checkbox next to it. So let's start off with this common HTTP feature, static content, default content, etc. They're located under IIS, Information Services, Web Services, or www services, and then here are my components. So application development, common HTTP features, and inside these common HTTP features are the actual component items that I'm looking for. Here is my static content. Here's my default document, HTTP error, and redirection on the left. It is up to you to make sure that you click through all of them. And what I find, sometimes people are not clicking through all of them, or they think that they click through all of them, and then something happens during the deployment and the application doesn't work. Just make sure that all these items are selected and double check. I will provide you with a PowerShell script later or as attachment to this tutorial that you can run to make sure that all these components are activated. I do, however, encourage you to do it by hand at least once so you have an understanding of how it's done without any automations. Now, towards the bottom of this article, you will see that you have similar instructions provided, how to go to Control Panel, how to find them, and then the instructions are offered for Windows Server installations as well as for Windows 10. Now that we have installed all the necessary components, it's time for us to move on to the installation of the actual application. I've already downloaded the application. You can take it wherever you are taking the components of the application. And what I'm going to do is I've gotten this zip file that essentially contains everything that I need, the backup to my database, etc. And I'm going to simply extract it here. Now I have a program called 7-zip that allows me to unzip files a little bit faster. So I'm going to use 7-zip to extract files. Now I can extract files to a particular directory, which is what I'm intending to do, or you can just simply dump them in the entire directory. Okay, so now that my installation or that my extraction is completed, it's time for us to start playing around with the various components. Now I have some components installed as part of the infrastructure inside Docker container. Namely, I'm using my Redis as the Docker container. Now there is no official version of Redis for Windows. There is only a workaround, so it's not recommended that you run even in pre-production environment Redis on Windows. However, many people do, and if you want to do so, just Google for Redis for Windows, and there's going to be an MSI file that you can just install, and it becomes one of the Windows services. In my case, though, I will be using it in Docker, and I will provide you with all the necessary Docker Compose files so you can restore this infrastructure on your own machine. Now that I have my installation directory unzipped, I can take a look at what's inside. Inside, we'll find a bunch of files, a bunch of directories, and one of them is going to be identity service we will be installing later. There's going to be a connection string file where we have to specify how to connect to the underlying databases. And there's going to be a DB folder. A DB folder here contains a backup to MS SQL. In my case, I'm installing MS SQL, but the procedure for Postgre is very similar. It's going to contain a backup file that we will use to restore the database. The next thing we need to do is we need to actually use this directory and put it in a place where we can bring up a website. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to be using my IIS. Now IIS is what's going to run the application, and currently I have some applications already installed here, but I will have them turned off. As you could tell that I have already some samples installed here, but they're all deactivated. Now, by default, I prefer to install my applications in a particular space on the disk, and that's going to be under inetpub, dev.root, and then all my applications are going to end up here. Now, the reason I choose to install it in this particular folder is because this folder by default is where IIS wants to look for all the files, and there aren't going to be any permissions issues. Now, if you want to install it in some other directory, you need to make sure that you give proper permissions for the IIS user to execute against that directory. You can do that quite easily. So let's create a new directory, Creatio demo. Demo. And if I want to install it, let's say inside this directory, and I want to point IIS to work in this directory, I need to make sure that the IIS user has the necessary permissions. I'll right-click properties on the directory, I'll go into my security, and I'll make sure that the user actually has permissions. So let's go here under edit, I believe, and let's add a new user. It's going to be IIS, ISUSR, I believe. Let's check names. Hopefully it picks it up. If it doesn't, IUSR, something like this. Let's search for it. No, not in the domain, in my machine. And object type. This is probably the hardest part. Okay, I can't find them. Let's go in the advanced. And in here, we can start with searches. Find now, but what am I looking for? Let's start find now, and IIS here. That's the one that I want. So this is the user that I want to know. Again, didn't get it right. Sorry. Let's do it again. This is the one that I want. IIS IUSRS. So just a weird name, but you just have to make sure that you find this user. Okay, so now that I've selected this user to have access to this directory, I also want to make sure that I grant full control to this directory. Otherwise, the user that executes the thread will not be able to touch the files and modify them as the application requires to do so. So make sure that you allow full control to this folder. Okay, and now we can click apply and we can click on OK. Now, on some machines where you do not have administrative access, that would be a problematic issue. So make sure that you talk to your system administrators and they allow you to that they allow you to connect to or execute something as the administrator. Just give me a second. I'll try to re-log into my machine. All right, so now we've applied permissions to this folder. So after having reconnected, now we've applied permissions to this folder. And the next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I copy the content of our zip folder inside this directory. So let's go back into our previously extracted directory and just copy the whole thing. And I'll use Control X to cut, and I'm going to paste it into this directory. Now, after having pasted everything back into this drive, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to try to create, with the help of IIS, we're going to try to create a website and the application pool. Let's open our IIS manager. And in here, I have some sites and some application pools, but they're all stopped, as you could tell. So let's create a new one. We'll add a website. Let's give it a name. So I'm going to call it Creatio Studio. And let's give it a path to the folder that we have extracted our product in. So Creatio demo. Now we can specify, we have to specify a port. I'm going to pick 7010. Any port will do, 82, 85, 80, whatever the case might be. Just make sure that this port is not occupied by anything else. The host name I'm going to specify as my own local host name. This is the name of my machine. If you want to find out what your machine name is, just open your console and type in host name as one word, and you will know what your host name is. Now, the only reason I'm doing it is just because I'm addressing this machine from other applications by this host name. So it makes sense for me to make sure that my IIS site is going to be responsive when I'm addressing this way. Okay, so let's save this. And now let's open the website, right click on it and say add application. Give it an alias of 0 and specify a physical path to the same folder, but inside that folder, there is another folder called TerraSoft Web App. So let's just make sure that we select TerraSoft Web App at this point. Good. As soon as you add this application, a new application pool will be created in IIS. If it doesn't get created, you can go and manually add it by hand. So all you can do is you can say add application pool, give it a name. So let's say test pool. Make sure that it's a CLR integrated, start immediately. Here's my test app pool. And if I wanted to add an application pool, so for example, I'm going to add an application. When I'm creating it here, I can select the application that I can use any pool that I have previously selected. So you can go ahead and create the pool first and then add the application, or you can just simply add the application and the pool will be created. Now, if the pool doesn't get created in the right way, then just make sure that you override it by hand. Okay, so now we've got the application pool and we've got the website configured. And if you try navigating to this port 7010, then you're going to get an error. We have not specified a connection string to our Redis database. We have not specified a string to our database server, and this is what we're going to do next. So the website at this point is not working at all. All right. If we want to follow the instructions, we can take a look how we can install Redis and how we can install the database. But in my particular case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply start my IIS. So my, not my IIS, my SQL. So I have SQL installed already. I'm not going to go through the installation. Just follow standard SQL Express installation tutorials online, and you will be able to figure out how to do that. In my case, the service is not started, so I'm going to go and start. You don't need to do that if you never shut it down. So if you just simply installed it, then you don't need to do anything. I'm also going to start the agent as well. So just come here and click start. Okay, perfect. So now everything is up and running. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to log on to our SQL server, make sure that we note the connection string, and then we're going to have to go and adjust this connection string. All right. For that, I'm going to use SQL Studio. But before you do SQL Studio, let me point out a couple of common mistakes or common issues that people might be having. So let's go into SQL server, I believe it's called. I think that's the installation center or import-export data. Sorry, SQL server. Where is this? Management Studio Profiler, error. You know what? Let's just skip it for now. Let's go straight into Studio. Inside SQL Studio, we'll use this product to restore the database and feed the file that's located here in DB folder. So this is what we're going to be restoring right now. Let me connect to my instance. I'm connecting as the administrator with the help of NT authentication. What you need to make sure of on your SQL Express, and this is probably the easiest configuration, is to go right-click on the name of your server, click Properties, and in Security, make sure that you allow SQL Server Authentication Mode. Now, you can use it with Windows Authentication Mode. In my particular case, I'm using SQL Server Authentication Mode rather than Windows, so I can specify the username and password directly in my connection string when I'm using it with my product. Okay, let's go in a database, and I have, I believe, one database here already installed. So let's just simply right-click on the databases and say Restore Database. So here's the option, Restore Database. And we're going to specify device from which we're restoring, and device happens to be just a physical location. So we're going to go back on our C drive, find Creatio demo, find DB folder, select it, and here's my backup file. And let's click OK. Now the Studio database, that's a default name that's going to be given by the creators of this backup. You can rename it at this point. And why don't we just take a look what we called our website in IIS. We called it Creatio Studio. And let's go ahead and call this thing as well, Creatio Studio. Now it's going to perform a full backup. It's telling you the version of the backup, and just simply click OK. The backup doesn't take too long, and in later parts of the tutorial, I'll show you how to restore it with the help of PowerShell, so you don't have to do it by hand. Okay, so now that we've restored the database, we also need to make sure that we have a user who can connect to this database. Now, to create a user, you can go into Security, into Logins, and just simply right-click on the login, create new login. Come up with the name, make sure it's a SQL authentication, provide the name, username, and password. Make sure that you uncheck Enforce Policy Security, so you can provide some simple passwords such as 111. Since it's just a development machine, we don't want any issues with the security here. So I've done that already, and I've created myself two usernames. One is called Creatio, one is called Supervisor. For no good reason, it's just the name that I've decided to give it. Let's now go back into our database, the one that we just restored. And what we can do is we can either right-click on the database here, go into Properties, and we can specify permissions, okay, and create user mappings this way. But what I find the easiest is just to simply go to a login, right-click on the login and go to Properties. And from the Properties, you go to User Mappings, okay? Choose the user mapping that you would like to use. In this case, you can say Creatio Studio, and make sure that you give it a role of DB owner. Now we can do the same thing for, let's say, another user if you want to have more than one user connecting to this database. So all we have to do is user mapping. And where's my Creatio Studio? And let's just give it a DB owner. Perfect. So now we have a user. We can try logging on. So to make sure that I can actually connect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect now, and I'm going to try to reconnect. And instead of using Windows authentication, I'm going to try to use SQL authentication. And I think the password is Supervisor. Let me connect. And I can see that I can connect, and I have access to Creatio Studio. I can perform queries. So let's make sure we use Creatio Studio. And let's select, I don't know, ID from contact. And if I execute the query, you could tell that I'm getting some records back. Perfect. So I've got my database working. It's now time for me to configure my connection strings. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually copy this database name for later use. But now let's go ahead and configure it. So in our, I think this is us, right? No, this is us. On this disk directory, there is a file called connection string. Let's find it. Here's a connection string, and I'll open it with my favorite text editor. So here's my connection string, and I have an example of a connection string that I was using in the past. This is what it's going to look like when you open it on your screen, and we're going to have to modify a couple of lines here. The first line that you want to modify is this. This is the line that's responsible for specifying where your Redis lives. Now, in my case, my Redis lives on my local host, so I can just simply say localhost or localhost. I have to assign a database. By default, Redis, when installed in Docker or as a Windows service, has 16 databases with the 0-based index. So 0 is the first database and 15 is the last one. So we're going to give it, let's say, database 15, as I'm pretty sure I'm not using it for anything at the moment on my machine. 6379 is a default port for Redis, so if you haven't configured anything differently, then 6379 is going to be the port that Redis will listen on. The next thing for us to configure is this line, and this line is our database connection. Let me just copy this database connection string. You can build your own, but since I've already pre-built it, I'm just simply going to copy it here, and we're going to tweak it a little bit. So in this case, I'm specifying a data source for my instance of SQL, and I can easily get it if I look at my SQL Management Studio. you can tell what this is. It's going to say your connection string here, not connection string, the instance of the server. You can also simply disconnect from it and try to reconnect. And here's your connection string, not the connection string, but the server name. The initial catalog refers to the database name. So if we're going to go back here as a, let me just log in. And the database that we would like to target is this. So select this database, press F2, and just simply copy the name of the database. So that's going to be my database name. Now the user ID, and mind the space between the user and ID, this is the right spelling, is going to say Creatio, and this is the user who's going to be accessing our database, or essentially this is going to be the user that the application pool is using to access the database. We're then specifying the password, and this is the reason that I wanted to use SQL authentication, so I can specify it very vividly right here in my connection string. And then a couple of other properties, how to manage the connection. This is all we have to do in order for us to start with the application. So let's make sure we save this, and we can now roll down our studio. The next thing that I want to do is I want to simply check if my application is running. Now we can specify additional properties and additional settings and configure them, but that's something that we're going to do with the help of a batch file that I've prepared for us that will do all this work for us automatically. Let's make sure that we can navigate to 7010 and that the application actually starts. In some cases, this application may not start and it will give you some errors. So in this case, system argument exception parameter host cannot be empty string. Now it's too bad it's not telling us where, but we simply need to go and configure, go and find where we did not configure this. So maybe it's in our connection string. So let's just simply find the connection string, and host has to be, I believe, this way. So I believe I missed the word host. This is the proper spelling, and I forgot it. So if you make a mistake, you will get an error here this way, this kind of error message, and just make sure that you can debug it. You will also get some ideas or some hints into what's not working. In this particular case, you could clearly see that there's a lot of mention of Redis. So you know that something is going on with Redis. Let's just try to F5 on this page and reload it. If everything goes correctly, I should see a login page, which is what I expect at this point. Also, mind you that you get some redirects here. Okay, and at this point, we can try to log in with the supervisor. Now, another reason that I've created this Creatio supervisor username and password here is that what the database credentials are in here for this database, they have nothing to do with what your username and password will be here. And the reason they have nothing to do here is because this is how you're accessing the database, and supervisor is how you're actually accessing the application. The first time we start the application, it might take us a little while to load the application, but then essentially everything works just fine. Now, once your application is loaded for the first time, you can try navigating from place to place. You can go to different sections just to make sure everything works fine. The best test and the best advice that I can give you is to just go into a cogwheel here, scroll the way down, go to your advanced settings. Another, by the way, shortcut in the advanced settings, if you open a new tab, and if you go to /0/dev, it will also take you in the backend. Now, when you're here in the backend, the thing that you want to check is to make sure that everything compiles. You usually do it only for the first time on the machine that you're installing the application for the first time. So if it's your server and it's the first time you're installing application for the first time, you want to make sure that the dependencies are addressed. To make sure that everything is installed, just simply click on compile. If you're missing some components, the compilation will let you know immediately, or it will let you know immediately after it fails to compile. So it's one way or the other. If your compilation is successful, then you know everything is installed correctly. Now, this is not the first time that I'm installing an instance of Creatio on this machine, so I'm pretty confident that things will go as planned. Now, after this compilation is completed, you can then go ahead and convert it to development and file system mode, or do whatever it is that you want to do. And in my case, you could tell that the operation was successful. So I now know that everything that I did is correctly installed. The next couple of things that we want to do is we want to probably configure it to operate with the to work with the Exchange Listener, to maybe install identity service and things of that nature. Now, previous episodes demonstrated how to configure Exchange Listener, so I'm not going to spend time on that. But what I will spend time on a little bit right now is to show you how and walk you through a PowerShell script that will help you configure the application in a similar fashion. So let me close this down. Let me close this this thing down. Okay. Let me close all this stuff down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop all these applications. I don't want it to consume any RAM right now. So I'm going to stop them all. My test pool I can stop. And everything should stop now in Creatio Studio. Let me stop this one as well. Okay. Perfect. Let me now find, I believe, I have a directory here on my builds, and in my install scripts, install creation. No, that's not the right one. Just give me a second. I'm looking for it. Maybe it's in this episode that I copied it. Postgres database, install Creatio. No, that's not the one. 1 second, install Creatio. Let me see if this is the one. Right. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create an application pool, or we're trying to create essentially a PowerShell script that helps us with the database. So before we did quite a lot of steps manually here, and what we're going to try to do now is we're going to try to build the same thing, but now with the help of the PowerShell script. Now let's explore some of the infrastructure that I kind of alluded to before, but I haven't really shown it to you. So in my Docker, I have a couple of containers running. So as soon as it starts, you'll see that I have Exchange Sync running. This is the Exchange Listener container. I got a Redis running, and I got a Postgres database running here as well. Now the Postgres database contains two containers actually. One is just the actual Postgres database itself. So that's the thing that stores the data and allows for persistent data storage. But then I'm also running a separate container for pgadmin. And the pgadmin is the container that allows me to manage my Postgres database with the GUI rather than with the command mode. Now you can tell that I've exposed port 8080 for pgadmin, and I've exposed port 5432 for my database. I've done the same thing for my Redis, and I exposed port 6379, and this is why I can connect from Creatio running on Windows to Redis running in subsystem for Linux on Windows. This is how I'm running my Redis. So if I simply navigate now to localhost port 8080, and let's try make sure that it's actually work. I will be greeted by my Postgres. Now I've configured my username and password already, so as soon as I connect, I should be able, oh, there's an update, great. As soon as I connect, I should be able to see my server and all my databases and whatever else I have here. Now with the help of this tool, just like we did with the help of SQL from Microsoft, with the help of Postgres, we can also restore the database in exactly the same way. If we want to go to database, we can say create, and once the database is created, we can essentially come back here and we can restore the database. So the process is exactly the same. But rather than using this GUI, what I would rather do is I would rather not touch the GUI at all, and I want to make sure that I can install everything with the help of my PowerShell. So let me open Visual Studio, and let me open this directory, and I believe this is not the right place, so let me just open this guy. All right. So what we're seeing here, yeah, I think this is the right place, and I will share all these scripts for you. So what we're seeing here is inside this file, we're going to start installing the application. Now the PowerShell script starts off with the couple of parameters it's asking for at the input. So it says that I need to know the app name, I need to know the folder name, some DB user and a DB password, some ports, and basically a bunch of other configurations that are necessary for me to install the application. Then we're going to go and we're going to start with the various installation steps. So step 1, we need to make sure that we create the directory. I'm taking simply the app name and I'm saying I'm going to create this directory and I'm going to copy everything into that directory. I'm then going to restore my PowerShell, restore my database with the help of PostgreSQL, and here's how I'm restoring it. So here's 2 steps to restore the database. First, we execute command in Docker to make sure that we create the database, and then we execute the command that we actually restore the database. And I can go ahead and delete the database folder if I wanted to, and then I can start configuring my connection string. And here I am parsing my connection string file. I am looking for the Redis name, and I'm just simply giving it a localhost Redis DB number, which I'm taking as a parameter into the script, and I'm specifying the port. I'm doing exactly the same thing to address the connection to the database, and at this point my database is restored. Now in Microsoft SQL, restoring the database, as you saw, it takes no time at all, maybe a second, maybe 2. On Postgre, it takes quite a bit of time. In my case, it takes up to 4 minutes to restore a database. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking that nothing is happening, things are happening. It just takes significantly longer. The next step for us is to create IIS. Or create the website and create the application pool. These steps are exactly the same for MS SQL installation as well as a Postgre. I have install Creatio in this install script that I will share with you, and this is for Postgre. I'll probably give it a proper name. And then I believe there is an install script for SQL, and you could tell that the SQL is slightly different, and this is just to make sure that I am now restoring the database with MS SQL, but the rest of the script is actually exactly the same. So let's proceed with the installation, take a look at what's happening here. Creatio, register, we're going to create a web app. We're going to go and update Clio because I'm going to be using Clio to make sure that I can connect to my application. Then inside my application, I'm going to install Clio Gate. Then I'm going to use Clio to turn off these widgets for news. I'm going to override a couple of other settings. I'm going to set up my default time zone to a particular value. I'm going to override the user session value, etc. And I'm going to go and reconfigure a bunch of stuff here, all with the help of Clio. And then at the end, as soon as the Clio is done, reconfiguring my application, all I want to do is I want to make sure that I start the process and navigate to this host and port. Now, the way I launch it is perhaps not the way that you would launch it normally, but I just find it a little bit easier inside Visual Studio to do it this way. So inside my Visual Studio, in the launcher JSON, what I have is I have a couple of launch files here. So if you go inside the Visual Studio debugger, you will see that you can launch this PowerShell script with a couple of configuration options. Install Creatio PSQL, just regular PowerShell, install Creatio with MS SQL. When I want to install Creatio with PSQL, I have to address this section. I have to specify the app name, folder name where this stuff is stored. I have to make sure that I specify username and password, the port where it's going to live, the database or Redis database number, as well as Redis port, and a couple of other parameters, and they're specific to my application. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to give it a app name. We're going to call it Creatio Studio. Now, one thing that be careful of is, for some reason, I found that if I call through PowerShell scripts my database with the uppercase letters, then something is not working correctly, and the database is always created in either lowercase or uppercase. And it's probably something to do with my script, but I couldn't figure out it real quick. So if you want to use this script and you want to use these launch parameters, then just make sure that everything is in the lowercase. Okay, so folder name, I will explain what that stuff is and how it works. But we're going to specify that to connect to my Redis database is going to be a supervisor. The password is also supervisor. Let's put it on the port 7020 just to make sure it lives there. And the MS application was installed on Redis 15, so let's give this Redis 14. My Redis port is 6379, and I'm using Studia Softkey backup file. Okay, so now that I've configured my launcher, essentially what the launcher file allows me to do is, rather than typing this entire command by hand every time, I can just simply now open my installation file and say, apply these launcher settings, okay, and just simply go ahead and launch them. It will start the PowerShell in Visual, well, not in Visual Studio, but it will start an instance of my PowerShell, and it will create me this application. Now, what I realize is that I may have called my application pool and my website to very similar to what Windows instance already has, so it may or may not fail on me. I didn't think of it. But in the meantime, while we're doing this, or while Visual Studio is doing this, and it's going to do it for a couple of minutes, let's go and take a look how my infrastructure is laid out here. So on my disk C, when I built my Docker files, I've created a couple of volumes. I've got volumes that I'm passing to pgadmin. I've got volumes that I'm passing, or disk space that I'm passing to PostgreSQL. And in PostgreSQL, what you're seeing here is essentially what's on Linux. These files are called. So this is inside the etc directory. And I don't remember the exact the exact name of this directory, but we got to look at the Docker Compose file. So I'm passing it, and essentially I can take a backup of this directory, and this would represent backup of my entire server. I've created myself files called DB images. DB images are files that I'm using to restore my database. Just like in Windows application, you had a DB folder. When you're going to download a Postgre file, there's also going to be a DB file. Now, this DB file is going to be obviously in different format and called something different. So what I did is I essentially copied them all, because I only need one per type of the application. So if I want a studio, it is always going to be the same backup file. If I want a full bundle, then it's also going to be exactly the same file for bundle. So I just simply copied them and pre-copied them, so I don't have to make sure that I'm copying the entire thing. Just kind of speeds things up a little bit. So this is what this file name is. Okay, now let's go back into our studio and take a look at what the studio is doing now. So PowerShell is now trying to restore database, and it essentially gotten to this point. It gotten to a point of here creating the database, right? So it probably already created. This process takes no time at all. This is really, really fast and inexpensive, but this takes some time. So what are we doing here? Well, the first thing when you're restoring a database is you need to create it. Now in MS, we didn't have to do it, but in Postgre, you first have to create a database, give it a name, specify some of the parameters, and then you need to make sure that you're restoring it. Now, granted that it's living in the Docker, so it's living inside this kind of a isolated environment, we have to use a docker exec command out of the PowerShell to restore it. Now, there are other ways, but I found that this is the easiest to get it going. So all I'm saying here is docker, go and execute some command in interactive mode. I am addressing the container where my particular database lives. I'm specifying the username, or basically parameters, how to restore it. I'm saying no owner, no privileges, couple of other keys, and essentially here's my database name. Now, where am I going to take this database name? I'm going to take it, I'm going to take it from USR local DB file name. Now, what we saw now is that I made a mistake, and when I restored the database, or when I gave the parameters to launch, is I did not specify a unique name for my application server. So this application server, Creatio Studio, already exists. So what we can do is say Creatio Studio PSQL, right? So now that's going to be a unique name. I just make sure we give it another, just for now, I'll clean it up later, but let's make sure that we do this, 7030, okay? Let's save this and let's try launching it one more time. So the same way, PSQL. So now the name of my application, the name of my The name of everything is essentially unique. Cannot debug until the what? Until has started. Okay, so I crashed the PowerShell. So let's start a new one. And let's see if you can launch in Noah. Okay, let's see if we can add another instance of it. Can you launch now? Okay, let's close this one and let's reopen our studio one more time. So sometimes this happens, and that was my fault. So back to where we were. Let's go back to installer. Let's go back to debugger and just simply launch it. Okay, so now it's copying it to Creatio PSQL, and what we can do is we can essentially go back to our local disk C and we can take a look at what was happening in the past. So if we're going to go back to inetpub and we're going to go back in the root application, you could tell that here's my Creatio Studio, and I just essentially copied everything into one directory. So I made a mistake here. So a few things that I need to do. When I am removing the application, the first thing I would normally start off with is I'm going to go back to my MS, into my IIS. Inside my IIS, I could tell, here's my Creatio Studio. And inside this Creatio Studio, I can just simply delete this thing. I can right click on it and I can delete it if a machine allows me. But before I delete it, yes, I'm sure I want to delete it. Before you delete it, make sure that you're deleting actually the right one. You might have a ton of applications here. And now we're ready to come back here to Creatio Studio application pool and delete this thing as well. So let's remove this one as well. Now everything is fine here, but what you need to know about is that under your users directory, usually, depending on how your machine is configured, you may also get an application, you may also get a directory for your user for every application pool. So the way my machine is configured in particular, every time I'm adding an app pool, it creates a directory for this user, and then happens to be about 200 megabytes, or maybe even 500 megabytes if I'm, whoa, that's huge actually. So what you may want to do is you want to make sure that when you're deleting the application, that things are simply that you're deleting them. If you install it 10 or 15 times, I mean, 5 gigs is not that much. But what you may want to make sure of is that you actually go and delete it, right? Because this is junk right now. This user doesn't exist. It was created for us when the application was added, and now we just cleaned up and now everything is fine. Now, don't delete too much. This is my actual user. Don't delete temps, and these might be actually useful for you. Just make sure that you only delete things that you want to delete. Okay, there's nothing else to do. The other thing that we may want to do is we may want to just free up a few resources. So we're going to go to SQL service, and since I'm not using MS SQL on my local environment, I'm going to go and stop this application here. So let's search for SQL, SQL server, and I can just simply stop it. I no longer want to use it. And I believe this one agent is also running. This will free up maybe, I don't know, half a gig of RAM. Not much, but if you're unlimited resources, that might actually make significant changes. Okay, so now you could tell that here's my Creatio Studio PSQL. So this is the one that is being installed, but then this Creatio Studio, we can just simply nuke this directory. So the previous one that we used for Microsoft Windows. Now let's take a look at the application, what the script is doing now. So created new app pool, environment was configured, try logging in. So it's trying to log in right now with the Creatio permissions with the help of Clio. Somewhere here we'll see that the Clio is being checked or updated. So Clio is trying to here, Clio was reinstalled to the latest version. Clio is our command line interface. Now, the first time you're trying to connect to Clio, this will take some time, and that's because well, the application actually needs to start something. And as soon as the Clio was able to connect, it's going to try to install a Clio gate automatically. Clio Gate is the API extension that allows us to perform things such as setting up configuration settings, installing packages and things of that nature, specifying your cultures, configuring many different things, and essentially everything and anything and everything about Creatio can be done with Clio. So sometimes you'll see the remote server return errors. That's fine. All we're doing now is we're configuring system settings. You could see that they're all being updated. I'm turning things on and turning things off. I am installing, setting myself to debug mode. And then at this point, my application is completed. I'm going to try to log on with the supervisor. I'm logging on. You could tell that there is no more this widget that tells me things about the news anymore. So that's gone. And there are going to be a couple of other notable differences. As soon as my application is installed, you see it's in the debug mode. If I go into my profile, you will also see that I have my language configured for myself, as well as the default time zone for all users. Now all I have to do is just simply choose my date-time format if I so choose, and my time zone, but I'm happy with the default configurations that are applied. So essentially at this point, everything is configured, as well as the Exchange listener. So if we wanted to simply go and let's see if we can add an email really quickly. So let's go to mailbox settings. Let's create a mailbox, and I'm going to add my work email, and that's going to be Office 365. I'm going to provide my username and password, and if everything is installed correctly, then I should be able to connect. Perfect. It's been successfully added, so now I know my Exchange listener is also connected to this instance, and I'm going to go and immediately change my settings, as I do not wish for any emails to be downloaded. Right, so you can just go ahead and configure your email or go through the Exchange listener configuration. So this is essentially how you would configure Creatio to run for the first time on the new instance of the application. Now, just for good measure, since we're in the debug mode already, let's click on this button. Let's make sure that we can also perform this step to recompile our application, just to make sure that nothing is broken. And if application compiles, installs and compiles, and we know everything has been installed successfully. So let's give it a moment. Hopefully it's not going to be too long. In terms of performance, if you're wondering what's faster, running it on Windows with MS, running it on Windows with Postgre and Docker, or Postgre natively installed on Windows, perhaps I'm not the best judge. I can't tell you what's faster, what's better. I found that it's just as lightning fast in one technology as it is with the other. I honestly did not find any differences. Operation is successful, so I know my Creatio is perfectly installed now. So I can close this thing, and I can go back to my, let's say, to my PG admin, and just to make sure that I can connect to my database, just to kind of give it a quick look. So what you will see here is that we've got this Postgre SQL now. Here's my Postgre SQL, and here's my previous attempt that has failed. The database didn't actually fail to restore, but we failed to create IES and the pool. So what I can just simply do here is I can delete this or drop this database. It's going to ask me if I'm sure. I say I am, and it's going to go and delete it. Now, the web UI for pgadmin is not as refined as, let's say, a native application such as SQL Studio, but it's good enough. It's definitely good enough to perform most of the common tasks. If I want to go now inside, let's say, my schemas, I want to go to my public, and I want to go into my tables, Here's a list of all the tables, and it gives you all the same features as before. You've got here under tools, I believe, query tool. And from the query tool, you can query whatever you want. So let's just say that we want to query something. Select ID from, and I believe it's called public dot contact, if I'm not mistaken. ID. I think everything needs to be in single quotes here, I think. From public contact. That's weird. Select ID from public contact. That's that looks right. Maybe I need that. Oh no, hold on. It needs to be double quotes. Right. Double or single? Well, whichever way. I don't spend a lot of time here. Select ID. Okay, so there we go. So everything needs to be escaped with double quotes. So this is kind of an unfortunate way of that we need to address PSQL, but this is the only difference that probably you're going to care about if you get to work with PSQL. And most of the time when you're doing development, you quite honestly don't care. All right, so this concludes our session for today for how to install Creatio. I will provide you with all the necessary files for installing Creatio with the help of a script, and I will provide you with the Docker Compose files that you can, let's say, resurrect the environment if you so choose, and then just simply use my files if you want to see how it's done. I'll provide you with two options, with the option for Microsoft SQL as well as Postgre. And if you have any questions, as usual, please raise an issue on the GitHub repository where all the files are going to be posted, and I will try to help you out as much as possible. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. And the next episode is going to be dedicated to working with integrations. And we're still going to do a little bit of infrastructure. We're going to have to install an additional component called Identity Service. And then we're going to try to use Identity Service to authenticate ourselves and to exchange some data with Creatio. So see you on the next episode. Thanks.